Paul, have you got my screen there?
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, it's yeah, there you go. Yep. So did you want to make any comments, Sarah, before we get started?
If you want, we can get started. If not, I can also do it. It's up to you.
Yeah, are you you're gonna, is it being taped?
Yeah, I've already started recording.
Okay, good. All right, it's all yours, Joe.
All right, thank you, Paul. Afternoon, everybody. Hope you're doing well, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the roundtable. It's always fun. I will talk a little bit today about responding to climate change. And I think my title was Fight Back or Leave or something like that. Today, I'm mostly going to talk about fighting back. I am the co-leader of the USDA Southwest Climate Hub. The presentation that you're about to see was developed primarily by Emily Elias, who's the director, and was originally invited to do this, but she had another appointment today and couldn't make it. So she asked me to go ahead and do this. And since she's the boss and I'm the co-leader, I said yes.
I understand.
First of all, I want to start with a couple of ideas about how we respond to climate change. And it's very important in terms of how you develop a response to know what these terms mean. Mitigation, that's kind of the one that we have, I think we spend most of our time talking about. And mitigation is important because that's the things that we do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to try to limit the effects on climate and try to actually reduce the amount of climate change that happens. The other one is adaptation. And adaptation is the actions that we take to adjust to a changing climate. So today, I'm not really going to talk about mitigation. It's, the more you get involved in this work and the more you follow it, sometimes these two things get so convoluted and so mixed together that it's hard to tell, a good idea which of these categories it fits into. And obviously some really good ideas will fit into both categories, but I'm going to sort of stick with the premise throughout this presentation that especially in the Southwest, we're at the point now where we need to focus our efforts on adaptation. We're in the midst of this deal and, trying to do something in mitigation. First of all, we're a relatively small part of, of the problem from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint. And what we can do to reduce those emissions is going to have a limited effect. Not to say that that's not important in other sectors, but it's right now, I think from a land management, agriculture, nature management standpoint, we are looking down the barrel of adaptation pretty hard. So I'm going to more or less confine my remarks to adaptation. First of all, a little bit about the climate hubs. There are 8 of them. They started in 2014 by under Secretary Vilsack, who was secretary at the time and is secretary again. So we survived at a little bit of a reduced activity level in the Trump administration. And now the climate hubs are being asked to do quite a bit more as we move back into the Biden administration. They're a partnership between multiple USDA agencies, and our primary charge is to support agricultural and natural resource managers in making climate smart decision making. Surprisingly, climate smart has really gotten to be pretty interesting in terms of what does it actually mean. Over the last couple of months, we've actually spent a lot of time saying, well, what is climate smart? Because almost anything that you do can be climate smart, but by the same token, that same management action or that same policy can be kind of climate neutral or climate not very smart, depending on how well you implement it. So it's kind of hard to, programmatically, it's kind of hard to make that distinction. And you can see here the Southwest Climate Hub covers Southwest region as well as Hawaii and the Pacific Islands. So we actually go all the way out to Guam and a lot of those Pacific Islands. We work most closely with the Southern Plains Hub that's headquartered in El Reno, Oklahoma, the Northern Plains Hub that's headquartered in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the California Hub headquartered in Davis, California, a little bit with the Northwestern Hub that's headquartered in Washington. And the climate hubs have three objectives. And one of those is not new research. As a rule, we don't do new research. We focus primarily on science synthesis and assessment, that is looking at what's out there, even if it's generated within USDA or other branches of government or universities or overseas universities. We kind of try to synthesize the science and assess the relevance of it for our region. We work a lot on technology transfer and tool development, which are, those first two things are pretty much standard USDA type work. But the last one there that we've been putting a lot of attention on is stakeholder engagement and knowledge co-production. And I'll use that phrase co-production, knowledge co-production, a couple of times through the presentation. But what that means is scientists, landowners, institutions, universities, agencies, and all those people that are involved in this thing, everybody working together to produce knowledge rather than the approach where the scientists crank it out, publish a paper, hand it off to extension repackages it and then sends it out to landowners. These are co-production where we all try to work together. One of the innovations that we are charged with, and that I think we've done quite a nice job on, is innovations in usable data. And don't get too involved with this map. We're going to come back to it later in depth. But, for the first time, we've got a new institution in these climate hubs that has just started up in the age of big data and staffed by people who know how to manage big data and know how to package these things so that we can communicate using big data. So our challenge is understanding those spatial and temporal trends and whether and what those mean for risks in agricultural production. And one of our solutions is these analysis tools and visualizing tools that look particularly at indemnity payments by location, crop, and cause of loss. So that helps us identify vulnerabilities. Like I said, we're going to come back to this map, but in general, it shows by county where the payments are and how big they are for causes of loss through USDA crop insurance programs. So I think this makes absolute sense in that we look at the past 15 years and say, well, where have we actually had to bail people out financially with losses? So, both from the standpoint of the farmers and ranchers that we work with, as well as from the standpoint of the taxpayers, this is a good way to identify what is it that's causing these losses, and what is it that's causing reduced crop production. And we'll come back to that later. I do want to mention that this this map and the software platform that underlies it was developed here in our Southwest Hub by Dr. Julian Reyes, who was a postdoc for us. And he's now gone on to greater things as the director of the climate hubs out of the at the national level. So we started him out, and he's the boss now. So one of the other things that we've done is innovations in knowledge co-production. And, you know, this sounds obvious, I think, at some levels. But when you look at practice, and it's not just in agriculture or in land management or response to climate change or anything else, but these ideas of peer-to-peer learning with an objective in mind. We've always had peer-to-peer learning, both in a bad sense and a good sense. And I think that peer-to-peer learning has been facilitated by people's access to the internet. And I mean, there's no end to the list of bad things that have happened. You know, just look at the rise of the hate groups and all that sort of stuff. In a sense, that's peer-to-peer learning and people sharing ideas, and not in a good way. But, you know, in terms of land management, climate change, and agriculture, we are trying to harness that energy and harness those effectiveness, especially in that P2P, that's peer-to-peer learning. So how did we take all these resource managers that represent tribes, all these USD agencies, NRCS, the agency that I work for, the Food Security Agency, Risk Management Agency, our local extension services, Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, the State's Department of Agriculture, State Departments of Environment, parks, municipalities, all these institutions. How do we actually get the professional resource managers in those organizations to deal and to work as part of these peer-to-peer learning groups and come up with knowledge, new knowledge that is shared to meet an objective. We don't want to just let this go wherever it goes. We need to start out with some agreed upon objectives, and how do we manage that process to generate that new knowledge, and then how do we capture that knowledge and then get it into those programs, as well as getting it out to other people to implement as they manage land. Well, one of the things that we did to start the project off was we wrote a series of articles on an assessment of vulnerability and some adaptation and mitigation strategies that we could implement in the Southwest. And we did that as a special issue of Climatic Change. It's a very popular, widely read journal. I think we had 7 articles in that issue that talked about different sectors like crop production, rangeland livestock production, irrigated agriculture, dryland agriculture, all the different sectors of agriculture, and what might we do in those different sectors to better adapt to a changing climate. So everything that you're going to see kind of from now on is based on those articles that were in that special issue. So I want to talk a little bit now about the basis that we use for determining vulnerability. And this is a really good model. This is a kind of a generic vulnerability model that a lot of people in risk management, it doesn't matter if it's financial risk management, health risk management, anything. This is a good model to work off of, and a lot of people use to see if we can determine vulnerability in a qualitative and quantitative sense. Pardon me. And this is our vulnerability framework. This is the vulnerability framework that was adopted and first published by the International Panel on Climate Change in 2001, the group that won the Nobel Prize, the IPCC. And you know, it's a pretty widely accepted approach to assessing vulnerability. And we use that as our framework. So we start out with exposure. And exposure is, and I'll give you some examples of each of these things as we go through. Exposure is what, how is it going to look? What are these climate change things that we're going to be exposed to? Is it more rain? Is it less rain? Is it hotter temperatures? Is it less freezing in winter that allows insects to overwinter? Just those sort of basic variables. So exposure plus sensitivity. And sensitivity is important because that determines how it's going to affect your operation. So, you know, we may have exposure in terms of, well, we get reduced rainfall in southern New Mexico in the summertime. Well, if you're an irrigated agriculture farmer, that really doesn't mean that much to you. You get most of your water from irrigation, from surface water or from groundwater. So you may not be particularly sensitive to that particular exposure element. So if you add exposure and sensitivity together, that comes up with impact. So what's the likely potential impact of that climate change variable on your particular operation? And then we weigh that off against adaptive capacity. Well, okay, what in terms of adaptive capacity, can you get another source of water for the irrigation example? Can you switch crops that doesn't use water? Can you expand your operation? And I'll show you some, like I said, I'll show you some examples of each of these elements that we use in determining overall vulnerability. And vulnerability, if you want to think of it, is essentially risk. This is how risky is this going to be for us, and then how do we manage that risk? So let's start out with the climate and water resources of the Southwest U.S. These are typically the things that we talk about when we look at exposure. How are these things going to change? Well, obviously, we're the hottest and driest region of the U.S. If you don't know this, this is as a citizen of the Southwestern region, I think everybody ought to know what the four deserts are in the Southwestern region. The Great Basin, right here, covers most of Nevada and some into Utah. That's kind of the classic sagebrush steppe. You know, if you have spent any time at all in that part of the world, it's basin and range. That means interspersed mountain ranges with a lot of basins that don't drain anywhere, and cold winters, hot summers, dominated by sagebrush. Kind of classic movie rangeland. Likewise, now we have three hot deserts. That's the cold desert. We have three hot deserts. The Mojave. How do we know when we're in the Mojave Desert? Always look for Joshua trees. If you're in the Mojave Desert, you'll see Joshua trees. That's what we see around Las Vegas. You ever see a movie, an old Western movie, and they're shooting outdoor shots and they're riding through the Mojave Desert, or they're riding through Joshua trees, you know that was made in the Mojave Desert. The other one is the Sonoran Desert. That's over around Tucson and over to the California border, the iconic plant of the Sonoran Desert is the cactus, the saguaro cactus. So if you see a saguaro cactus, you know you're in the Sonoran Desert. And if you see a saguaro cactus in a movie and they claim that they're in Tennessee or something, you know they didn't really go very far from Hollywood to shoot that movie. So then the fourth hot desert, the hot desert is the Chihuahuan. That's the one we live in. Our iconic plant would be mesquite trees. So the Chihuahuan Desert is reflected by a lot of these honey mesquite trees that we have growing all over town and all over the country. It extends down into Texas as well. So there's those four deserts, and this map also shows you where we grow crops. So even though we use a lot of groundwater and a lot of surface water, most of those irrigated crops are grown along drainage ways where the best soil is. One other thing that we've got, in addition to the big data, you know, we're kind of the first, I think, institutional government startup that's had access to some of these incredibly helpful remotely sensed products. This is a view of snow cover in the Western US on March the 5th. So it really helps you communicate to people, as well as do from an analytical standpoint. It gives you a lot more data, but this really helps you communicate to, you know, if you're reliant on snow and snow melt for water for irrigated agriculture, this will really help people understand what that snow melt is going to look like where they live. And those products, and as well as that big data, allow us to make incredible maps like these. This map shows reliance on groundwater and surface water for irrigation. So you can see that out here on the west, most of this is going to be snowmelt runoff, but also some groundwater. All of this area here in the high plains is the Ogallala Aquifer. And that's how much they use. The blue is their reliance on it. The red is, when you're red, like down here in this area of the Texas Panhandle, they are incredibly reliant on Ogallala groundwater particularly for center pivot irrigated crops. So it just goes to show you, you know, what that distribution is. You can see out in California, it's a mix of everything. But that gives you an idea. And even here in, you know, in southern New Mexico and all through New Mexico and southern Colorado, we are reliant not only on surface water, but on groundwater. But most of that agriculture takes place within about 50 miles of the Rio Grande River. Another element that we think of when we talk about exposure is changes in temperature. This is a map that shows temperature from 1986 to 2016, so the last 40 years, compared to 1901 to 1960, so essentially the first half of the 20th century. Every place is hotter. Every place was hotter over the past over the past 40 years than it was the first half of the 20th century. There's a very few places that haven't been affected, and that's those white areas. But by and large, every place has been affected, and some of these hot spots here in South Central Nevada, deserts of California, right around Phoenix, some of those areas have really gotten a lot hotter. 2.5 degree Fahrenheit change on average is a lot hotter over that century period. So in terms of exposure, just what are we going to be confronted with going forward? Future precipitation, highly variable, drier areas are going to get drier. So virtually all of the Southwest is expected to get drier. If you look at some of those other areas, the Northern Plains is actually predicted to get wetter. In some cases, that may be good. In some cases, not so good. We're going to be challenged with a declining winter snowpack. And that's going to be affected by that El Nino Southern Oscillation. We're going to see an expansion of the subtropical dry zone. So, you know, if our problems now are drought, it looks like our problems are going to continue to be drought, only we're going to be dealing with more mega droughts. And we know from, longer term human history, century and millennial analysis, mega droughts are what cause drastic changes in civilization. We're also probably going to see a greater proportion of the precipitation falling in extreme events, which means it's going to be less easy to manage. And I think the one phrase I want to look at here is that variability. These models do a pretty good job of predicting this change stochastically. And that is, we know over a period of, say, 10 years, we're going to see an increase in what we just saw in February here, that very cold, very short period of very cold weather, which has a huge impact on crops and growing crops. And we know that we're probably going to see that, if we see it once every 10 years in the past, we know that we may see it 2 years out of 10 in the future. But the problem is we don't know which years those are going to be. So we're pretty good at predicting things stochastically, but we don't really have that spatial temporal precision that we can base management decisions on. Okay, so there's some good examples of exposure. Let's look at sensitivity now. The climate change sensitivity, and in particular, this one, when we look at what do temperature increases really mean? And if you look on that map there on the right side, virtually everything that is brown, orange, yellow, and depending on the size of the circle, means that there's going to be less water available for irrigation. The places where we predict that we're going to see blue are not very many and not very blue. So in general, in all of those places, we're probably going to see less water available. So, if you are reliant on surface water for irrigation, you really ought to plan for less surface water availability. Another aspect of sensitivity from the standpoint of high value orchard crops, especially, we may have a longer growing season. Probably going to see reduced chilling hours. And if you grow a particular tree crop that requires chilling, and a lot of our fruit trees need minimum chilling hours to through the winter to set fruit, and they also need that chill to keep insects at bay. So that's going to probably amplify the hydrological drought. That is just the amount of moisture that's available, particularly as soil moisture. So there's going to be a couple of things that we need to deal with there. Now, again, if you have a crop or you grow a crop that doesn't require a longer growing season or doesn't respond to a lower growing season, and doesn't need those reduced chilling hours, you may not be sensitive. You may not be sensitive to those changes in water and those changes in temperature. Okay, so we've got exposure and sensitivity. Now, let's talk about impact. You put exposure and sensitivity together, and together those things tell you what the impact is likely to be going forward. One good way to look at this is looking at the past 30 years. And that will tell us a lot about risk and loss or the impact that it's had. And here's that map again that I referred to earlier. This is on a county by county basis across the continental United States. And it shows the dominant cause of loss in each county over those 30 years. And what caused that dominant loss? This is in terms of dollars paid. And I'll show you some county by county applications of this in the coming slides, so we can pinpoint that a little bit better. But you know, it's obvious in looking at this map. Now, and I do have to say, this is based on USDA programs. So a lot of these white areas in the Western US are land that is largely owned by Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, or doesn't necessarily grow any crops. And this is all about commodity crops. But it still gives us quite a bit of insight into what's going on out there. If we look at this map, drought is by far the main cause geographically across the country. Virtually the whole eastern 2/3 of the US, every state is affected by drought. That's even, you know, you wouldn't normally think of drought in Pennsylvania, Delaware, along those mid-Atlantic areas, all down into the southeast, but you know, that's a fairly common cause of crop loss. And if we want to reduce those indemnities, or the money that taxpayers pay to support these people through crop insurance, this is, you know, we need to figure out how to alleviate those losses, or how do we better manage that risk. At the same time, if you look in that western or that eastern 2/3 of the US, that purple area is excess moisture, precipitation, and rain. And particularly in that northern plains, over in some of the Corn Belt areas, when they get a lot of rainfall in the spring, they can't, soils are too cold, or if it's too muddy, they can't actually get in the fields to plant. So we've got crop losses there. In that Sandhill region of Nebraska, it was one of those big groundwater users in that earlier map. That purple there is hail. They had it's not at all uncommon for them to get big hailstorms in May and June, and that just wipes out the crop. Likewise, you can see spread out through the Western US, you know, we've got some areas that are actually high heat that have caused crop losses. We've got some areas that respond to freezing, some of these areas down in here, and some of these areas down in Florida. So, you know, there's about 10 things on that list that cause those losses, but it's dominated by drought, excess moisture, including flooding, and losses to hail. There's a tool that you can use if you want to, you know, this is publicly available. If you want to use this tool and just look at your home county, or, you know, if you know someone there, you can actually figure out where the money's going through these insurance program and these indemnity losses. So you can look at the metric of payment indemnity. You can set the dates on that website. You can look at all commodity crops and look at the cause of losses. And you could also actually look at it from a standpoint of, how close do you want to break that down? In this case, we use 10 classes and set that into percentiles by dollars. And we're going to look at two counties here, one up in one county in Utah, and we'll look at Doñana County. So in Doñana County, over the past 30 years, 30 plus years, the dominant cause of loss was hail, followed by freezing and followed by heat. Now, granted, we're not looking at the absolute amount. The absolute amount of money is on that axis across the top times 1,000. So compared to a lot of these other counties, that's relatively small. But over the past 30 years, we wouldn't necessarily think that hail and freeze is a problem that we have with a lot of our crops. It only takes a couple of events to drive that those numbers off the charts. If we look at Utah County, just west of Salt Lake City, just south of Salt Lake City, by far the biggest loss over the past 30 years for that county has been drought. And like I said, you can actually go into the site and you can look at that county and see what crops the most of the losses have been charged to. So, if you look at that and you see constantly that one crop keeps popping up over the past 30 years, if you see, well, they're losing a lot of corn to drought. Well, going forward with less available irrigation water and less reliable irrigation water, we may want to think about a less water intensive crop. So we can look at that from that impact perspective and from the ability of people to adjust or to respond to these things. What's their ability to adapt? What do we grow in the Southwest? We grow a lot of beef, grow a lot of hay, some grain and field crops, some specialty crops. Other livestock is dairy. And, that one usually doesn't show up primarily because all of the dairy cattle in the Southwest are in small lots and they're fed crops that are grown by irrigation. So typically we don't see a lot of those losses show up there. So let's talk about beef for a minute. There's a US drought monitor for March. That's not good. The darker red those colors are, the worse the drought is. And the darkest color out here in that Four Corners and northern Arizona and southern Nevada is level 5. That's extreme drought. Probably the worst part of that, though, is the map on the right. That brown color means that it is currently in drought and likely to stay in drought for the period through the end of May. The yellow color is probably coming into drought or likely to be in drought status during that February to May period. This little area up here in Washington and Oregon is likely to come out of drought during that period. And that's with the exception of a couple of places in Illinois and Indiana and up here in the Northeast. That's about the only places that are currently in moderate drought that are likely to come out. So what this is telling us is that for the vast majority of the western half of the United States, we're going to be in drought at least through the middle of summer. One of the tools that we've developed in the climate hubs to help ranchers deal with this, as well as to help policymakers come up with maybe do a little bit of forward thinking about policy, is called GrassCast. And what we try to do with this is predict how much grass is going to grow for those people that are grazing livestock. So you can look at this, excuse me, you can look at these maps and say, well, over here on the left, based on where we are now, if we have an average or slightly above average year, our forage production for the year is going to be pretty good. In the middle here, if based on where we are now, if we have an average year, the blue is going to be okay. The green is going to be about average. The red and yellow and brown is not going to be so good. So for that area of southeastern New Mexico, even if conditions are good going forward with the water deficit that we currently have in place, we're probably not going to get out of that in terms of forage production. If we have even an average year, we're in trouble. If we have a bad year, we ought to be out of that business for this year. Things just aren't going to get any better for a lot of eastern New Mexico based on these maps, unless we get a very good year. And that previous map I showed you says, we're probably not going to get even average precipitation, at least through the middle of the summer. So, these kind of maps are very helpful for, like I said, for individual ranchers to look at that and say, boy, this is not a good year to put a lot of money into buying more cattle and assuming a lot of risk. From a policy standpoint, from a technical assistance standpoint, if you're extension or if you're USDA, you say, yeah, we probably ought to get some people into this area down here and start working with the ranchers now to see if we can figure out what we're going to do. And then from a policy standpoint, we say, well, we ought to be pushing some of these insurance products that are built around forage production and loss of income from livestock systems. So GrassCast is the tool. Again, it's one of those. If you just type in GrassCast, it will take you to this site. You can explore individual counties. You can explore different scenarios and see what you come up with. And don't type, when you type it in, use the hyphen between grass and cast. I didn't. And I wound up on a bluegrass music podcast. So it allows you to explore the internet sometimes. Another big problem that we have, wildfire recovery. We spend a lot of money on fighting wildfires. Over half of the U.S. Forest Service budget this year is dedicated to fighting fire. That's not planning for fire. That's not getting over fire after the fire is out. That's fighting fire. So essentially, you could say, believably, the Forest Service is now a firefighting agency. If over half of their budget gets spent on fighting fires, it's pretty hard to make that other half go where you want it to go. And this tool is very good, very interesting set of tools that we can use. In this particular map over here on the right, it shows you the sites. And if you burrow down on this site and just get finer and finer in resolution, it'll actually show you individual parcels of land that are high priority for reseeding after fire. And this particular tool will let you set the intensity of the fire, the conditions that occur after that fire. And there's another tool that we're working on right now that will actually help you pick the species to revegetate, to plant, to revegetate with, because in a lot of these forests, we're not very confident that the species that are there now are the ones that will grow in a future climate. So that's a tool that individual managers can use to help us identify areas that we want to put priorities on. Another one, a little bit different approach, fighting fire with fire. That eastern part of New Mexico, eastern Colorado, and virtually all of the Great Plains, over the past decade, almost every state has had unheard of levels of wildfire. And in one sense, that's good because that means there's a lot of grass out there. But in another sense, it's bad because we're not in control of it. And it's very damaging, it's costly, it's deadly. So, we want to figure out how we can better manage fire in those areas that traditionally don't have to deal with wildfire, like most of the Great Plains. So we've got a project, several large projects there that we've convened trainings to promote the use of prescribed fire for vegetation control and to help keep these wildfires under control. Establishing fire break lines, to protect rural towns and to protect fields. One of the big expenses from a program and policy standpoint that we didn't really think about much going into this. About 10 years ago, they had a lot of wildfires in southwestern Kansas. Up until that time, almost every fence in southwest Kansas was built with wooden fence posts. And so a lot of the ranchers in those areas lost all of their fences. And, fencing is a huge cost for both for property boundary fencing and for managing fields within a property. So we had to respond with policy and some programs to help people get those fences rebuilt. It's a big labor cost, a big materials cost. We didn't even have enough barbed wire. Steel posts, those things, the prices just went completely out of control. So, we can use tools like this to help us think through some of these scenarios and to identify those vulnerabilities. Another one is an example, small farmers in Cochise County, Arizona, right around Phoenix. And, before I go on, it's important to remember that these problems are very different for big farmers and small farmers. Big farmers have a lot more adaptive capacity sometimes, especially in terms of capital in the bank or access to credit. Small farmers don't necessarily have that capital, and they don't have access to credit. So it's difficult to respond to some of these things. In Cochise County, there's very little surface water available, depleting groundwater. We're seeing big farmers expand, and they actually can dig deeper to get groundwater. When they dig deeper to get groundwater, that means it's inaccessible to small farmers. A lot of these small farmers are losing their access to water. And in that part of the world, if you don't have water, you don't have a crop. So in terms of adapting to climate change, there's a lot of different things that we can do. We can adopt these practices that we've known, that we've had around for years and years, and we can adopt a lot of those. But sometimes those are just not going to be enough. We're going to have to diversify activities. And typically in adaptation, adaptation is doing these things here, adopting new practices. How do we change what we're doing to respond to the climate? Diversifying activities is what we call transformation. We're going to have to quit growing some crops, or some producers are going to have to quit growing some crops and move to other crops, other different types of livestock. We've got a project here at the Jornada Experimental Range where we're trying to see if Criollo livestock genetics can actually improve the drought tolerance of livestock. Most of our livestock here are Angus or Angus Hereford crossbreds, and they're not particularly good at dealing with hot weather and drought. So we'd like to know if these Criollo, some of the original cattle that came over from Spain and that region of Europe and were brought over by the early settlers, the early explorers, if we want to know if some of those genetics can be used to improve the drought tolerance of these traditional European breeds. So, and then finally, from a policy standpoint, we need to figure out how we can help, especially small farmers, get access to some of these insurance programs and some of these assistance programs to help them both better adapt and better transform. Thank you. I'll be
Thank you, Joel. That was quite
happy to take.
That was quite a mouthful. I'm
Be
glad
happy to take any
to
questions.
see the SARE program down there in the bottom. I was very involved in setting that up. Anyway, I was glad to see it.
Oh yeah, a lot of these, Paul, a lot of these things that we need to do, we already have agencies
Yeah, we do.
who were set up originally to do that. In particular, the agency that I work for, Natural Resources Conservation Service, started out as the Soil Conservation Service.
Yes.
And we actually we began in the 30s as a soil erosion service, and we were set up to respond to the Dust Bowl.
Yep.
So, this is why we exist. Sometimes we're not particularly nimble in terms of how we change in response to a lot of these problems, but the agencies that we have in place mostly already have a mandate to do this kind of work.
Yeah, they do. I just wanted to ask, the monsoon season doesn't seem very regular these days. Last year we didn't have hardly anything. What's happening there? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, the monsoon is predicted to get weirder and weirder. Probably we're going to see, our average precipitation may not change that much over a year. But we're very likely to see in the Southwest, we're likely to see less rain in the monsoon and more as extreme events. So we may see the same amount of water, a little bit less, but it'll be in fewer rainstorms. The other problem is we're going to see more of that rainfall outside of that monsoon.
Like
So
last year we had a lot of.
That's going to get pretty weird as far as weeds. You think about all the weeds that come up in your yard when we get winter rainfall. We're just not set up for that.
Yeah. But last year, for example, we had rain in the spring, but hardly any monsoon. And we'll see what this year we didn't have any rain earlier, so we'll see if we have a monsoon. So anyway, anyone else have a comment or question? Go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, Joel, those incredible maps. Now, back when you were looking at exposure, you had a map of red and white, where the red was increasing temperature on average from the beginning of this century. There were some white areas, or last century, I'm sorry, there were white areas that did not increase. How can there be these areas that don't increase amongst all of everybody else is increasing?
Mountains, very high mountains.
Oh.
And didn't you also say public lands too, Forest Service and BLM lands?
Yeah, that's the white by land ownership was payments from USDA. But what Charlie's referring to was the last 40-year temperature increase compared to the first half of the 20th century. And most of those areas, Charlie, if you notice, they were fairly round.
Yes.
Those were mountaintops.
Wow.
Yeah. So they stayed fairly constant, just because they're higher elevation.
Amazing.
So I have a question.
Go ahead, Annette.
If somebody, it's like farmers grow the same crops and over, those kind of get wiped out and like taxpayers kind of have to pay for that. Is there anything kind of set up that tells these people like, hey, switch to this other crop, it's not failing for other people? Is there anything set up that tells them like to quit growing something that will cause a liability there for the rest of us taxpayers?
Well, I can tell you one thing that doesn't tell them that, and that's the market.
Well,
a lot of people, they grow these crops because they are valuable. And especially, if you look at a place like Central Valley of California,
Uh-huh.
I mean, there's, I'm not sure exactly what the number is, but more than 75% of the fresh vegetables that we consume that are grown in the US are grown in that one relatively small area. So, the market says grow these crops because they're important. And we don't necessarily want to become reliant on growing those crops outside the country, because that's a really risky supply chain, as we've seen. So, we've got that part of it, but in the other part, like you just said, yeah, we've got a lot of crop by crop models that'll say, here's the risk associated with lettuce, but here's the risk associated with onions.
Yeah.
And so that, every individual farmer has to look at those things and say, well, lettuce is a much higher return on investment than onions, but onions are less risky. So, that's it's just, and Paul, I hate to say this, but just economics. It's
yeah, but if there's a market return is something totally different, I was like, sure. But if you're kind of backed up by insurance that, the taxpayer is going to take that risk, then you're going like, well, what do I have to lose, right?
Well, and
it's not the consumer at the grocery store that's then determining like, oh, that avocado, that's coming, up from South America is 10 cents cheaper. Of course, I'm going to buy that one,
Paul, what do we call that?
What's that?
There's a term in economics for getting people to make bad decisions with guaranteed money.
Yeah, you try the same thing over and over, and you're just an idiot.
That's very common, and
moral risk.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a moral risk.
Yeah.
There's a moral risk associated with all these policies, but from the standpoint of, in particular, some foods, it's certainly in the interest of taxpayers to have a reliable supply of those foods. And, you'd like to see that diversified a little bit more, say some grown in the eastern part of the US, some grown in the western part of the US. So we have to look at it from all those different standpoints. This stuff is really complicated. And I mean, you've got some very good points, Annette. And as any good economist would tell you, it depends.
I'll give an example. We should not be growing alfalfa in the Southwest. I made a mistake. I worked for Forest Service up in around Phoenix and so forth. And I made a mistake at a speech one time. There's more hay that goes to waste on ditch banks in Minnesota than you grow in this whole damn state. But the point is that some crops we shouldn't be growing here, maybe high value crops, but not low value crops. We shouldn't.
Exactly. But I mean, if the taxpayer puts money in it, I think the taxpayer should have a say in it.
Yes, that's right. But this crop insurance came along because something else wasn't working and they wanted to do something to help the farmer. And there's parts of that are not working either.
Well, and you know, I mean, it's like any other program, and it private sector or public sector. When you've got something that's as complicated as the decision making is with this, and you try to set up a policy or a program to get people to do what you want them to do, somebody always figures out a way to beat it.
Oh,
Exactly.
definitely.
Always.
Yeah,
Especially when they have a good accountant.
that's exactly right.
It's about finish time, but if anybody else has a serious question, go ahead.
I did have a question. I guess, you know, Joel, you were talking about how your agency started from soil conservation. By the way, I can't see myself. I'm blocked by the host from turning on my video. You were saying how your agency started from soil conservation, a smaller thing, and then has broadened out. And I wondered if you foresee a further broadening. And I guess the question would be, there's places where I've seen, I guess I'm asking about market failure. And you've been talking about, well, you measure it in cash value of the crops lost. And I'm thinking, I don't know if that's a big enough perspective. I know that I've read recently that 1/5 of our food production is being lost to invasive plants or invasives, animals and plants. And I know that collapse of pollinators is also a terrible problem. Now, these things are going to be like, I don't know when that gets measured into the equation, but if you're measuring it by money, it's too late. It's happened. And if the bees are extinct, you're in trouble because they're not coming back unless you're, I don't know, really lucky or really smart. So I guess what I'm wondering is, and I absolutely know that you're trying to get around these guys who are ready to beat any regulations that are put on them. I know that there's that Wild West side, but I'm also kind of wondering, do you foresee your agency going more in this broader direction? More tree hugging, more, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, James.
And that's been happening.
Yeah, without a doubt. And you use the phrase there, market failure, and I'd use another phrase that goes right along with it that most people don't necessarily put together, and that's mission creep. So, mission creep. What's market failure to one group is mission creep to another group. But we, NRCS, the agency that I work for, as well as other agencies, we have really large programs for pollinators. I mean, that's one of the areas of biggest growth. We are right now working on large programs for carbon sequestration. We're going to shift a lot of the funding that we get for incentives to try to get people to do things. In the past, we used a lot of that money to do to entice people to implement practices to reduce erosion. And we measured that in tons of soil loss per acre per year. Well, we're going to start moving a lot of that money over to carbon sequestration. And we're going to measure it in tons of carbon sequestered per acre per year. So yeah, we're moving into a lot of those areas. But there is a lot of inertia. And we've got wetland protection that we've done for 30 years. Paul, that's a big part of what the Forest Service did.
Yes. Yes.
Wildlife habitat, endangered species protection. I'm not sure, and in USDA, certainly, I thought, James, you were going to talk about a third of the food being wasted as one way to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Over half of our budget is nutritional programs in USDA. So we can deal with the waste of food. We already, like I said earlier, we already have an agency set up whose job it is to do these kind of things, and they know how to implement these programs. It's just a matter of turning the ship.
Well, I see Sarah has come on. We're getting close to our finish here. And I want to announce I think Jan is still on there. Are you still there, Jan? Yes? Anyway,
Yes.
Jan Thompson's going to do a talk next week in regard to multicultural awareness group. There have been a number of them meeting in the church concerned about how we deal with diversity and other. Do you want to say anything, Jan?
No, I'll save it for next week.
Okay. So that should be a really good program. Looking forward to it. And with that, thank you. And let's give Joel a big hand.
Way to go, Joel. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
Joel.
I appreciate it.
Right.
Good job.
Yes.
See ya.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Have
Joel.
a great one.
Right.